be a communist.
This one is a bit of a mystery still, when my first tweet is going to happen.
Ken is fun, and Ken is a great friend to Barbie.
I call it catching the F train.
I was just this fat unit, you know what I mean, in a suit, and it was clear that I was not the same as the others.
Welcome everybody to the 15th episode of WFA's Better Marketing, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by two of the most heavyweight thinkers and minds in the industry. And actually I say that not to be flippant, because as many of you will know, I'm not a fan of the digital metrics that have been thrust upon us, and neither am I a fan of some of the very old school metrics that don't really serve the modern era. But these two people, who I have to report, I'm slightly disappointed, are not related. Karen Nelson-Field, Professor Karen Nelson-Field, and Peter Field. Welcome to our podcast. I'm not going to introduce you, because if people in marketing don't know who you are, all I can say is, oh dear. Anyway, welcome both. So fantastic to have you here. Let's start with the most important question, and let me start with you, Karen. The most important one is always, how are you? I mean, you are flying around the world like nobody's business, grabbing attention for the attention economy. Are you well?
I am well, and it's exciting to be traveling, after such a long hiatus, so couldn't be happier. Good.
And you, Peter, looking very well? Are you well?
All well, yeah, looking forward to getting back to travel. I haven't yet put my toe in the water, but about to do so. I have a strange kind of nervousness about getting back to travel, because I haven't done it for 2 years, so I just got to kind of get back out there and do it. It's like being a young rookie all over again. First business trip. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. I'll probably get lost.
Well, listen, welcome both again, and I thought we'd start with one of the most important subjects in marketing, which is effectiveness, because in the end, if the pandemic has shown us, well, it's shown us many things, but in the world of marketing, it is that, how are we measuring what we're doing? Is it working? Are we doing the right thing? Are we investing in the right place? Have we got short-term, long-term right, and all of that stuff? So I thought we'd start with that simple question. When you look at the industry, Karen, and maybe start with you, how would you rate us out of 10 on our effectiveness measures?
You probably should have started with the father of effectiveness over there, but but I think from my side, it's hard to put a score on it, because, I only have a helicopter view, and I can only sort of see what the effects are of effectiveness or on effectiveness from the sort of context of attention. So, I don't blame this score on anyone, but I'd kind of say 4 out of 10. And that's because, and it's not from marketing effort. I think it's from inequity across impressions, and Peter and I have had this conversation lots of times. So I think there's a lot of flow-on effects from inequity of impressions that advertisers are not aware of, and then have a subsequent impact on effectiveness.
And Peter?
Well, I was going to be slightly more generous. I was going to give marketing 7.5 out of 10, and that sounds like a very arbitrary number, but it isn't really. 7.5 out of 10 corresponds to a kind of, I think, how marketing is compared to where it was at its peak before the performance marketing revolution kind of made us all go a bit daft. So we've lost about 25% of the effectiveness we once had, and I think it's down to the reasons that Karen's brilliant work is examining, as well as Orlando Wood's work on the impact of the performance marketing explosion on creative work as well. I think those two effects. But 7.5 out of 10 is, I think, the most generous I would be. Half of me wanted to say 5 out of 10, but I thought that was a bit mean, because there are lots of other challenges out there that have all contributed to this that are beyond the scope of marketing to fix. So I'm feeling kind. 7.5 out of 10.
Maybe we should average the two, right? And then we split right in the middle, and then we're all good.
Good plan.
But on that average, I mean, what that tells us is we're not doing as well as we might. I mean, how much do you think this is the fault of the algorithm and the platforms and the inappropriately named performance marketing? Should we start with you this time, Peter?
Happy to take that one because I mean I don't think it has to be this way. I think this is the really crazy thing about the kind of algorithmic world we live in. But so much of the work has been driven by a kind of short-term agenda and by a really important fallacy that somehow performance marketing obviates the need for, let's call it mental availability, strong brands, however we want to call it, that somehow we just don't need to do that in the modern world because we can use algorithms to serve our nudges, our last minute advertising messages to consumers at the point of decision or consumption. And that is, we know, totally flawed. I mean, Karen can talk more about that. Ehrenberg Bass can talk more about that. And the data I work with all says that brand building isn't getting less important, it's actually getting more important. So it's just not really built into most of the algorithms. They're not about reach, they're not about scale, they're not about building brands, they're about this ROI-driven obsession with bottom of funnel, low-hanging fruit kind of thinking, and it is so dangerous. You don't build businesses that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a massive fan, Peter, of and I always like to call him Les Binet because I think it has a certain.
I think he'd sooner be called Binet, but
I know,
who knows?
I know, but obviously, as we've all grown up looking at how you build brands and where you put a percentage of investment. What's your rule of thumb these days? What's the data show?
Well, we still offer kind of 60-40 as a start point. I mean, technically, I think our data says 62-38, but it's not that accurate. That a few percentage points either way is. So we still talk about 60-40, but we do always acknowledge that it's an average, and averages, of course, are precisely that. It varies enormously in context. We know that different categories and indeed different brands require different balances. It's really about the comparative ease in your category of building brands, and in some categories, more emotive ones typically, it's much easier to build brands, premium brands as well. It's easier, whereas in categories where it's less emotional, it can be more difficult, for instance. But also in some categories, it's much easier to do the whole short-term piece. If it's a very online category, there's lots of data flying around. We can do kind of short-term piece much more efficiently. But it's about balance. So in some categories, you need to lean into brand because it's tough. In some categories, you need to lean into short-term because it's more tough. But typically it's 60-40. But I mean, one of the interesting things that we've noticed over the years is that that sweet spot seemed to be leaning ever more into brand. There seemed to be a trend where year by year it steadily got a little bit more kind of brand, and never really been able to explain that. But I think the work that both Karen and Orlando have been doing is just beginning to shed light on this. And I think that's why I'm so interested in both of their work streams here, is that what both of their work suggests is that we're just not very good. It's not as good as we once were at building brands. The creative work isn't as good at building brands as it was. And our media deployment is certainly not as good at building brands as it was. And so we're actually having to lean more and more into it because we're doing the wrong thing. So I think there's some kind of interesting stuff going on about 60-40 that we need to put right, and I'm sure we can put it right. And there are the first optimistic signs that maybe we are beginning to turn the corner on what's been a pretty long, grisly 10 years of declining kind of trends.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, Karen, can you speak after 3 long years of work, which was reduced down to some simple lessons about this conundrum between brand building and short-term effectiveness? What's your view?
Platform performance really does mediate a brand's ability to grow or not grow, and we see that through the work we do with attention and mental availability. So I'm not being so harsh on marketers because to Pete's point, there has been a swing back to emphasis on growing a brand, but marketers are really unaware of how different the performance is across different platforms, and not just the platforms, but within the platforms. So different formats within the platforms can be the difference of night and day in terms of how much attention it gains. So without all that knowledge, it's so difficult for for brands to be able to, we've done share of voice sort of work, Peter and I, and it's so hard to sort of understand what are they actually buying against. And, even if they think that they're, inputting enough media dollars into brand growth, it's negated by the performance of the platform. So it's a big conundrum, and, I don't blame anyone other than, to your point, we've done lots and lots of years of research on this thing called an attention currency and an attention economy, and it does boil down to some basic lessons around platform functionality and understanding the norms. I think norms are your friend.
And what about the impact on creativity? Because obviously, there's a deep belief. I, for instance, a massive fan of brand building and using emotion to do that, and a lot of your work points out that you need to be a bit more precise about how you use it, and some great learning opportunities if creative people will use them. In my experience, on the whole, they go no, and don't want to. Have you seen a shift there?
Yeah, so what's interesting about that, I'm not sure if you knew this about me, but my first book was on emotions and how content diffusion, so in the kind of era of viral diffusion, and what emotions do to the ratio between viewing and sharing. So I'm a big believer in emotional content too, and our friend Orlando, if he were here, he'd agree. But what I see, and this is often not very, I'm not the most favoured when I say this from amongst the creatives in the room, is that even that is negated by the performance of the platform. So what we see constantly over and over and over again, that you could have a really highly emotive ad on a really fantastic platform that gives you really rich attention, and that same ad performs sort of slightly worse on the next one, and then slightly worse on the next one, and slightly worse on the next one, and you can see the pattern. So I often say that if creative was the driver of attention, then that creative would perform the same across different platforms, and it doesn't. So it's tricky because you go and build something wonderful, but if no one gets a chance to see it because of the nature of the platform functionality, then what do you do?
Yeah, and I was familiar with your work, and I particularly like the notion of bottom-up triggers and top-down triggers when it comes to emotion, and indeed the work you've done around how effective TV remains for all of the reasons of attention. Can you speak a little bit to that, and then we'll segue into Peter?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, we've actually just built a cinema model too. So first ever in the world, it's actually an extension of our TV model. So actual cameras in a real cinema, certainly not lab-based. So, what we do know is that big screens do help. But all the platforms have their strengths and weaknesses for different reasons, depending on the campaign. So, a lot of my early work was around television, but if I'm really honest, because of the fact that it is the year of attention, a lot of the platforms actually have pulled their socks up and really swung backwards. The pendulum swung a little bit in terms of building formats that have the opportunity to build both brands and, be, sort of refresh kinds of feeds, if you like. So I think that was a very political answer, and me saying I try not to do the who wins the race anymore, because I think that there's differences for different reasons, and it depends on the campaign, it depends on the size of the brand, it depends on so many things.
And Peter?
I think it's intriguing that we find, but not surprising, that we find that kind of creative work tends to perform. The platform ultimately decides how well that creative work is going to work. I think there is perhaps a little myth that somehow the creative work can overcome all of that. That if we produce the greatest ad in the world, somehow it will always get shared. I think the important learning is that we can screw all that up by just making dumb media choices, and I think that is the salutary lesson for us all. But I do think what we know from all of this is that it takes two things to produce really, really effective advertising. It is great creative and great media thinking. It's kind of always been the case. We've been through a long period now where those two disciplines have been separated from one another, and I think it's led to rather insular thinking there. But I think we need to put this all back together again. I think Karen's work on attention is just so important. I think we got seduced somehow into thinking that as long as we served these messages to people, then that was fine. Your work, creative work, would do its work, and that was it. It's clearly much, much more important that we understand the platform, we understand how it's working, and we understand particularly, the context in which that ad is working and the attention it's getting. So I am a huge, huge fan of attention as a metric. I think the sooner we move to it as a currency, and I know there are huge problems in moving a whole industry over to that, but I just think it has to be the way forward out of this morass of extremely questionable metrics that are out there that are governing increasingly the majority of ad spend. There is billions and billions of dollars around the world going into platforms where the metrics really don't in any way correlate with mental availability, and I think Karen's work hopefully will put all of that right through the device of attention. So I'm a big fan.
I think we probably passed the tipping point when people do understand how dodgy some of the platform metrics are and how they are really output driven, they're not outcome driven.
I do hope so, but I think we have to bear in mind that we all kind of tend to live in the world of blue chip marketing and sophisticated marketers, and I think they do get it, and I'm seeing the evidence for that in the data I work with, which tends to be amongst market leaders. But I think there is a long tail to the world of marketing, as there is to any marketing, any business world, of less sophisticated marketers who are still enthralled to the whole programmatic explosion, and think that the metrics are great and so on and so forth. So I'm not quite as optimistic as you, David, but there are definitely positives.
Yeah, but I think the work you've done to build this understanding of you've got to balance the short term and the long term is massively helpful, and I've certainly always advocated that. And what the data shows is there are plenty of case studies even coming out of the pandemic that say those that have invested in brand building have benefited more. But can I switch gear a little bit, because the other thing I find fascinating here is the capability gap. Let me describe it as that, partly caused by some of the platforms, of course, do fantastic training on how to get the most out of their platforms. It's free, you get to go to nice places, lots of marketeers are beguiled by it, and there isn't much stuff on brand building, and it looks to me like there's a bit of a capability gap opening here. Do you see that, Karen?
So I think there is. I think it's less than it was, if I'm really honest. So in fact, there was an anniversary of mine. So this was my whole research agenda when I was still at the university, and there was a photo recently as a memory that me at Facebook 10 years ago during the IPO period. So it's been 10 years. So I do think there's been some growth in knowledge, and I think even in those early days when I was still at the uni and I sort of uncovered this, I guess, misnomer that is likes, it's moved really a long way from that. So in those days it was all about attracting likes and paying for likes, whereas now I think there is more of a balance. I don't think that they're ever going to get a degree in ad effectiveness, let me tell you, but I actually genuinely see, and Australia is actually a small market of ours, so we have most of our clients internationally. So I do, in fairness, genuinely see the balance or the capability gap slightly closing. However, with that said, what I do know is they've got to sell their own performance, so, and so those that are, more inclined for performance marketing or small amounts of attention are going to sell that agenda versus those that have the ability to drive memory and minimize ad decay and things like that. So I think it's maybe not a capability gap, more of a what are we here to sell kind of gap.
But I do think, in my experience, what they were very clever at on the West Coast was dragging out the C-suite, not just the marketeers, for the tour to show them what they were up to. And I certainly worked for a CEO who came back from one of those and said, it's all finished, we've only got to use Facebook, we only need 6 seconds for this. And you go, no, it's all bollocks, mate. We don't need to do that. We need to refocus. So hats off to them for doing that. But it feels to me like we're moving into a more balanced phase. Your view, Peter, on the capability?
Well, again, we get conflicting signals. I do think there is a growing understanding that you can't build brands with 3 seconds or 1 second or whatever. We were misled into thinking it was going to be fine. I think that we do need reasonable attention levels, and Karen is the expert on that, so I won't suggest what they might be. But we can't do it in seconds. And I think that realization has understood. But then you've got to counteract that with the work of Orlando Wood, who has looked at the nature of creative work. And clearly we've got a generation of young creative people, particularly who've come through during the performance marketing era. And it has clearly left its mark on the kinds of ads that they are writing. And it may not simply be that. I don't want to put the blame on them. It's the pressures that they're on as well, the world in which they work. But it's led them to produce the kind of advertising that Orlando would argue is just less emotionally engaging. It's more didactic. It's more in your face. It is more led by the kinds of ads that we saw from the world of performance marketing. Prior to that, we were led by TV advertising. That is what kind of guided us in the early days of digital. And I think it produced some better work, frankly. I think the way we've gone now is it is all very stark, not very emotional. It's kind of in your face, and it's not seductive in the way that it needs to be. So I think there is that side as well that we need to think about. But I think the penny's dropped, I think, for sure. And I think there is a realization that there is a job to be done. So I think we'll just need to help support that.
The issue with that is that the seductive nature of an ad takes more time, right? So, they've had to change it because of the nature of, even viewability, which I'll tell you 75% of the viewability currency gives you no attention. But, it's such a problem for now, because these beautiful sort of emotionally led ads that sort of take you on this journey through this brand purpose is just so hard to achieve because of the amount of attention. But I will say, and this is an excellent segue, thank you, Peter, is that attention's not the only, it's important, but if you can have attention and still not have brand recognition or mental availability as we test it. And the reason for that is, there's the emotions and the subjective side of creative, but there's also the objective side of creative, which is, purposeful brand, and making sure that the brand is distinctive and frequent and early and sizable and all of that. And you'd be surprised. So that it's not a perfect relationship between, if you get attention, it might not still get chosen, or might not get clicked on, or might not get shopped at the next fortnight. It's also up to the advertisers to make sure that they optimize for the amount of attention they can achieve, and make sure that the branding is front and center. And we see that clearly. So we know there's a relationship between attention and also mental availability, uplift or decline. But then you get these weird deviations, and you look in and see why has this one underperformed, and you go, oh, that's right, because they've chosen the competitor, not that brand, even though they were the ones that had all the attention. So there's a bit of work to be done for advertisers to understand these norms of these platforms, but build functional branding that suits that particular format.
Yeah, and I think much underrated art are building the brand cues and understanding that, from use of color, use of logo, use of music, and indeed the brand idea itself, which I think can trigger things.
I think the branding issue is very, very important, but I think there is clearly an art to this. And lots of one of the big benefits that big and very well thought through brands have is they have all of these assets that contribute to the brand, so they don't have to labor it often. Branding has to be there, but they've got so many assets in their armories that just signal to the consumer that we're talking about this particular brand. It just gets easier if it's done well.
Yeah, I've got some new information and some new research which I've not shared ever. We only sort of found it quite deeply. We've gone back and coded, every single one. There's hundreds of thousands of impressions that we have collected, and we have been able to nominate them in terms of brand size. And to your point, and we knew this inherently, right, Peter, that, you know, big and small brands need more or less attention. I won't tell you which one because we'll get to that another time, but it absolutely makes a difference. So if you've got distinctive assets, you are the category leader, then in terms of how much attention you actually need to get to that point of purchase does vary to the small brands that don't have that. And what the irony is here is that often smaller brands can ill afford the platforms that drive longer amount of seconds which they need. So I kind of think that the big brands, they'll survive, but the small brands will get smaller because they can ill afford the big brand building, you know, platforms that give you enough attention to be able to drive their
And what about,
brand.
can we talk a little bit in that context about double jeopardy? Because it seems to me that the algorithms make what you just said worse, and you know how search engines work favouring scale actually. So if you're setting out to challenge in a marketplace, it's tougher and tougher these days. Does your data show that?
Yeah, I mean, double jeopardy is a concept that can be applied to different rules. So it depends on which one you mean, but we actually see a double jeopardy pattern within the mental availability space. But double jeopardy is about big brands, or we'll put it the other way because it's jeopardy. Small brands have fewer people that buy them less often. So that's the traditional double jeopardy rule, but it can actually be applied in all different ways. Interestingly, I'm about to write a paper on all the double jeopardy that we see in the different rules, because we see systematic patterns across all the research that we do, and one of them is mental availability. So you have to wait for that paper.
Peter?
No, absolutely. We've kind of always known this. I mean, some years ago, I did some work with the Nielsen organisation. We worked out that, in fact, the odds are stacked against smaller challenger brands to the extent of about 3.5 to 1. That is to say, if you really want to take on a brand leader in this packaged goods categories for obvious reasons, that you really need to find a way to ensure that your advertising works 3.5 times harder than the brand leader. And if you're really going to close that gap, now that is an enormous ask. In the past, perhaps smaller brands have had an advantage, and that many of the big brands perhaps contented themselves with solid and stolid kind of advertising that didn't excite anyone but kind of did the job, and they were able to get away with it simply because of these economies of scale, jeopardy kind of patterns that exist. You can get away with an awful lot as a very big brand. But I think, you know, many of the big brands have now woken up to this, and they need to defend their patch more powerfully. So it is not a great time, I think, for challenger brands to take on the big boys. It's certainly not gotten any easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's odd if I use financial services to illustrate this. You know, that what consumers enjoy is some of the new brands that arrive with new tech, basically, that makes their life easier. You get spend alerts and so on, the Monzos of the world, but the very fact that they don't have scale to survive as a business then gets in their way. So the scale players are still winning, which I think is a shame for consumers, actually, because there is the choice is being narrowed. Do you see that as well through the data?
So interesting you even say that, David, because in the book that I wrote a couple of years ago, the last chapter talks about, you know, this crystal ball, what will the next 10 years look like? Now, bearing in mind this was pre-COVID, so the book launch was the March the 12th, 2020, if you think about that date. So it was a stressful day. It basically, the piece that I wrote right at the end was how will brands grow in the future? Because the algorithmic editor that sits behind those that are investing more, you know, favors the big and, you know, doesn't favor the small. So to your point, I think the repertoires will shrink over time, and I don't think there's anything you can do about that. And I think, you know, Ehrenberg, God love him, will be turning in his grave to think that these patterns won't hold. But I don't think that's because, you know, it wasn't sound for 50 years. I think it's the nature of the supercomputer and the nature of the platforms that are available for brands to actually advertise on that these things are changing. So I actually think there's a whole nother science and a whole nother Ehrenberg-Bass kind of effort needed in the world of, you know, algorithmic editors and how Amazon treats your preferences in terms of what effect it's going to have on brands.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I mean,
Pete.
it is interesting because, you know, technology has, I think, enabled innovation to happen faster and more capably than it has in the past. So I think in some ways it is easier for new challengers to enter markets, but they all get to this kind of inflection point a few years in where they've kind of built the brand to a certain size, built the business to a certain size, usually done on performance marketing because they're novel, they're new, they've got something original. But then there comes the point where you really have to have the dollars to invest to build the brand for the long run. And that's the challenge that they face. Some of them will have pockets to do it, and those that won't will probably find that they just don't make it through that next growth phase. And there is no getting away from that. Mental availability, i.e. strong brands, is a vital requirement for the long term for a business. And if you kid yourself that the launch pattern that worked for you so well, which is kind of performance marketing driven off novelty, completely new product or service to people, that is going to see you right through to market domination is naive, because we know it doesn't. So, I think a lot of people have been misled by that side of technology, which has been great, which is the ability to innovate rapidly, get your product out to market at a speed and at a scale that's never been done before. That's great, but the mistake is to think that it means we don't have to worry about brands and mental availability. The reverse is true, I think.
And Peter, I saw something recent because, we speak about mental availability a lot as if everyone knows the concept, right? So what I saw a piece of your work recently, I think it really, and I use this slide, I quote you, but it encapsulates what actually falls below it, which are all these different types of business metrics that people don't really realize what business and what mental availability essentially encapsulates. You should tell everyone about that.
Yeah, well, it's very complex, isn't it? I mean, what we do know, I think, is that the constituent parts of mental availability have been evolving over time. I think that is my suspicion looking at the data. I mean, I think we were once more of a kind of awareness-driven. Mental availability was more simple. I think now it has got more complex. It is lots of things that make us think about that brand in the purchase situation. And one of the things we know from the data I look at that has really crept up the agenda over the last 10 years or so is the issue of trust in that brand as well. I think when people are looking at the choice of brands they have, there is ever more importantly, it's not the only consideration. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it dominates, but it has definitely got more important. And so I think, marketers have been looking for new tools to help develop trust in their brand. And I think that is the right thing to do, so long as we don't forget that mental availability is a broadly based property and encapsulates all sorts of things to do with the performance of the product or the service. As well as our kind of general level of salience for it. So I think the trouble with mental availability is it's actually very complex, and it varies from category and brand to brand. So it's difficult to define it precisely. Once upon a time we would have talked about having a strong brand, and I think that is really in some ways a better way of thinking about it than psychologist terms like mental availability. But at the end of the day, it adds up to the same thing.
Fantastic. And Karen, perhaps we can switch a little bit to viewability and the gap between OTS and a human actually seeing something, which appears to be getting worse. But the WFA have done a massive amount of work on ad formats, ad sizes. The platforms have really begun to collaborate in a way they certainly didn't 5 years ago. But what do businesses need to do to get the most out of digital these days and drive up their viewability?
Well, see, this is the problem. There's a gap between viewable and viewable with attention. And I think what people don't understand is the currency that they use right now. And, you talk about drive viewability. I've got the slide in front of me, which shows that around 75% of online ads that you've paid for against the currency you trust actually have zero attention. So when you've got a currency that fails you in that way, with respect to those who started the viewability, because I do actually pay tribute to those who started this concept that you have to have an ad, loaded before it can be saleable. I get all of that, but the technology's moved on now, and what we know is you can literally hold your thumb, keep it live, and be looking over at your cat. So I think the thing there is, I don't think advertisers should be working harder to build viewable, ads. I think they should be thinking about, because I have a strong view on whether it's a currency yet, but I think they should be working towards using attention as a quality layer. And that's how I see it. That, because at the moment, so to make a currency, I'm also writing a paper on this, to make a currency, it has to be widespread, trusted, basically, all of these things to be enduring. And there's a whole list of things, but widespread's the big one, which is what I'm going to say. And at the moment, we don't have cameras in 40 million homes. There's cameras in thousands, but not 40 million. And until that is the case, the currency is reach, and the currency is viewability. And what we're doing, or what I am trying to do, is kind of say, it is failing, so let's add a quality layer over the top of it. So I think your question is, how can you make advertisers, drive more viewability? I think the answer is, don't look for attention, because you can have a viewable ad with no attention, but you can't have attention without viewability. So they do work together. So once you understand those nuances and what predicts this extra attention on the top of viewability, then the conversation is better for advertisers.
Excellent. And the metrics that are used in a boardroom, let me go there, intrigue me, because obviously what people are looking for is continuity. If you're a non-exec in a board, you want to know that what you were viewing a year ago is making progress, and when the metrics shift so much, as in the metrics used, there's a real problem. So I don't see much stability in boardrooms where people are going, right, in this modern era, here is what we need to use as our KPIs to measure our advertising. And this is where perhaps attention as a currency will become valid. I mean, are you on a journey to that, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I genuinely think we're on the precipice of major change. And, we see that, every single advertiser asks, we hear it back from the media agencies, that the brands say, what's your attention strategy? So, I think this is going to be the biggest shift in 20 years since the viewability technology actually came out. I genuinely do. I do honestly believe that it's still in its infancy. So I call last year one, and I think, by year 3, there might be, we've got some amazing case evidence, and there is definitely some movement in incorporating it into systems. But I think, I look at even the data we have and the distributions that happen at individual level, and how much more we can know about big and small brands and all of that sort of stuff. I think there's lots more to come. So the key now is to get more data, so broader and deeper data, to make sure that this currency is trusted and it is stable, which is exactly what you just said.
Peter?
It's an interesting point you raise. I mean, I would heartily encourage companies to build in attention metrics to their evaluation, to their kind of brand health assessment. I think it's a really useful metric. I accept that it's a big difference between it being a metric and it being a currency. Understand all of that, but I think as it gains ascendancy as a metric, it will inevitably become a currency in time. I think, and we can technically deliver it. But I think it's a really good metric, partly because it kind of covers the two things that I was talking about earlier on. It covers the quality of the creative work. Karen is quite clear that different creative work can gain different levels of attention, but ultimately the level you get is dictated by the medium. So attention has this ability to tell us something about the creative work we're producing, as well as the media choices that we're making. So I see it as a great metric all round, a useful one to have, and to be added into those dashboards that companies ought to have. And that good companies do have. I mean, I'm sure, David, you're very familiar with dashboards. Lots of clients I work with have very elaborate, very sophisticated dashboards. I haven't come across one yet that has attention and metrics in it, and I'd like to. I'm sure you'll.
I can
please
point
do,
you to
please
some.
do. I haven't seen them yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And I think if I was looking to design one for a company, I would definitely want to add it to it. Karen, tell us more.
I will say one thing: human attention is different to viewability-based proxies, right? So just be mindful, we're heading into an era where it's a bit of a land grab in the attention space. And there's a vast difference between data that's continuously collected, and there's only a few of us in the world that can do that at the moment, to, metrics or measures that have sort of had a single instance and have had, lab-based data and call it, attention. So big difference. So let's not go down a path that, we ruin our opportunity before we even begin. So that's why I'm kind of cautious and sort of careful and considered before we sort of put anything out, because for me, it needs to be enduring. Otherwise, we're yesterday's clickbait, right?
I do think this is, my final question to both of you, I think, is around how marketeers need to set themselves up for success. But in that, I'd also include agencies, because something you said before, Peter, resonates. I mean, I grew up in an agency world that was full service. That's been broken apart, not necessarily to the benefit of the clients that the industry serves. So what about how to set up for success? Could both of you speak to that? Perhaps you first, Peter?
No, very, very happily. To me, one of the big issues for refocusing marketing is to ensure that the metrics they're being led by are ones that relate to long-term success. And I've banged on about this a lot, so I won't say a lot about it, but I think we are far too focused on ROI, and particularly very short-term measures of ROI. Now, that's not to say ROI isn't, of course, a really important metric, but if we are led by it, and there are lots of analysts and consultants out there for whom, the only currency for effectiveness that they seem to have any interest in is ROI, and it's incredibly dangerous because it leads you to all this kind of low-hanging fruit mentality. The best way to get good ROI is to be, tightly targeted, to serve, very efficiently at low cost a message to someone who you can nudge over the finishing line. And as we know from the wonderful mea culpa revelations of Adidas shortly before the pandemic, if you go down that route, it teaches you something very wrong about how to drive your business. It teaches you about performance marketing and digital tools. That is where it leads you. But when you do the long-term analysis, when you look at long-term econometric modeling, for instance, which I do think is very important, even in the quick-fire world that we all live in today, because if you don't take a longer-term view, you can't see the dangers of all of these short-term choices you're making when you're just chasing some kind of incremental improvement to ROI. So, I would just get marketers focused on, long-term growth, long-term profitability and all of that, because when you do that, you have to build brands. Brands, let's remind ourselves, are not just about driving volume, they're also about driving margin. And you combine those two, and that's the best impact you'll make on profit. And you won't get that double whammy benefit out of the short-term performance marketing piece. So, that is where I would point marketers to think about the year-on-years, think about the long-term growth, think about the metrics that show that you are, each year improving the brand and its trading strength, not just driving, kind of little short-term wins, which we've become too focused on.
Fantastic. And Karen?
So adding to that, I would say understand how different platforms perform relative to long and short term, because we know that there are differences, right? And there are norms depending on the platform and format. So understand how they perform relative to long and short. I also often say understand the flow and effects of inequitable impressions, because people sort of underestimate that it's not just a reach thing. We've just had a conversation about how it impacts mental availability. It impacts, any attribution you might do. It impacts any share of voice, share of marketing budgeting. It impacts creative. It impacts so many things. So that it's more than just single reach. And the last piece of advice I'd have to advertisers is, if you are thinking about a quality metric to supplement what you have now, make sure you get procurement on board. And the reason why I say that is because their entire remit is about cost reduction, right? And so here we are saying, actually, you should pay more for an impression because it gives you more long-term effects or more of what you need. So big part of the lessons that I'm trying to sort of explain to people this year is make sure procurement are on for the ride, because they are your boss.
Here. No, I just 100% amplify that.
Yeah.
This does require a change of mindset in the procurement process.
Yeah.
It does,
Yeah.
but I think it also means, that marketeers have to own that relationship, not blame it, which is often what happens.
Yes, that is
But
true.
anyway, can I say what a fantastic conversation this has been? I could listen to you both for hours, and between you and Orlando, you keep the industry grounded. There you go, fields and woods. I saw that on your Facebook thing. So back to long term and short term. In the very short term, I'll have the delight of meeting you in person in Athens when you're speaking on the 7th of April at the Global Marketer Conference. And I have to say, in this digital world that we've become so accustomed to, I can't wait to meet this community in person again, and particularly to listen to what you've got to say, and no doubt reveal some more firsts in your new paper. And Peter, don't know if you're going to join us in Athens, but it'd be great if you could.
No plans to. No, I love Athens, but
Well,
I
it's
haven't done any.
next phase. But again, thank you both very much, and thank you
Great.
all for listening to this. I'll be back next month with another Australian. David Droga, these days the CEO of Accenture Interactive, is going to join us, and I think he'll bring a different spin to what we've followed this year, because bringing together media creativity and the delivery of experience through technology is really the mission he's on. So looking forward to the next time, but particularly looking forward to seeing you all in Athens. Thanks so much for listening.